My name is Hannah Cooper. I'm 32 years old, and the moment my mom asked why I didn't drive myself to her birthday dinner, my entire world cracked wide open. It was such a simple question, innocent even, but it landed like a bomb in the middle of that crowded restaurant. Everyone went quiet. My husband Mark frozen with his fork halfway to his mouth, his mother Linda's eyes narrowing like a predator sensing danger, and me, sitting there realizing I was about to say something I'd been trained never to reveal. If you've ever felt trapped by people who claim they love you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story about how my mother-in-law stole my independence is going to show you exactly how control disguises itself as care. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with years of suppressed truth, and heard myself say the words I wasn't supposed to. Linda took my car keys months ago to keep me controlled. The silence that followed felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My mom's face went from confused to horrified in seconds, her hand reaching across the table toward mine, while Linda's expression transformed into something I'd never seen before. Panic mixed with rage, like someone who'd just been exposed after years of operating in shadows. Mark looked between his mother and me, his confusion so genuine it almost broke my heart because I realized he truly had no idea what had been happening right under his nose. Before I tell you how I got to that moment, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what comes next is a journey through manipulation so subtle that I didn't even recognize I was drowning until I could barely breathe. My hands were shaking as I set down my water glass, the condensation cold against my palm, grounding me in a reality I'd been avoiding for far too long. That question from my mom, so casual, so normal, became the thread that unraveled everything. I had become so accustomed to asking permission, to checking schedules, to making myself smaller and quieter, that I'd forgotten what autonomy even felt like. The restaurant noise faded into background static as I watched Linda's mouth open to speak, already preparing her defense, her justification, her version of events that would paint me as dramatic or ungrateful. But something in me had shifted the moment I spoke the truth out loud, something that refused to crawl back into silence. This is the story of how I lost myself so gradually, I didn't notice until I was nearly gone, and how one simple question became the key that unlocked my cage. It started so innocently that I didn't recognize the danger until I was already caught in its web. When Mark and I got married 3 years ago, Linda seemed like the perfect mother-in-law. Thoughtful, generous, always offering help before I even knew I needed it. She'd show up with groceries when she knew we were busy, offer to handle our mail when we traveled, suggest better ways to organize our finances because she'd been through it all before. Everyone in Mark's family praised her devotion, called her selfless, told me how lucky I was to have someone who cared so much. I felt grateful at first, genuinely grateful, like I'd won some kind of family lottery. But gratitude has a funny way of turning into obligation, and obligation into a leash you don't see until you try to walk away. The boundaries dissolved so slowly I couldn't pinpoint when helpful became controlling. Linda had a key to our house for emergencies, but she'd let herself in whenever she wanted, rearranging my kitchen cabinets because, "This makes more sense, honey." She'd comment on my work schedule, suggesting I was spreading myself too thin, that maybe I should cut back hours because stress isn't good for a young marriage. Mark always defended her intentions, saying she just wanted the best for us, that her generation showed love through action. I started second-guessing my own reactions, wondering if I was being ungrateful or oversensitive. When you're told repeatedly that someone's invasiveness is actually devotion, you begin to doubt your own instincts. I felt like a bird being praised for how beautifully I sang in my cage, never realizing that praise was the lock. The scariest part was how normal it all felt to everyone around me. At family dinners, Linda would speak for me when someone asked my opinion, finishing my sentences or gently correcting my answers as if I'd gotten my own life wrong. Mark's sister would joke about how involved Linda was, but always with admiration, never concern. I started to feel crazy for the discomfort growing in my chest, for the way my shoulders tensed when I heard her car in the driveway. This is how independence gets stolen, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small concessions that feel like love, until you realize you can't remember the last time you made a decision without checking with someone first. I was being slowly erased, replaced with a version of myself that was easier to manage. And the most terrifying thing was that everyone, including me, called it family. It started with rides that felt like kindness wrapped in concern. About 6 months into our marriage, my car needed some minor repairs. Nothing serious, just routine maintenance that would take a couple of days. Linda immediately offered to drive me to work, insisting it was no trouble at all since she passed right by my office anyway. Mark thought it was sweet, kissing his mother's cheek and thanking her for being so thoughtful. I accepted because refusing seemed rude, almost cruel, like rejecting someone's genuine attempt to help. Those 2 days stretched into a week when the mechanic found additional issues, and Linda never once complained. She'd pick me up every morning with coffee already waiting in the cup holder, asking about my day, offering advice I hadn't asked for, but felt obligated to consider. When I finally got my car back, something subtle had shifted in the dynamic between us. Linda started calling before I'd leave for work, asking if I needed anything from the store, if I was sure I felt safe driving in certain weather conditions, reminding me that she was always just a phone call away. At first, these check-ins felt caring, like having a safety net. But slowly, they became expectations. If I didn't answer, she'd call Mark, worried something had happened to me. If you're starting to see the red flags I missed, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like, because the web gets tighter from here. I found myself explaining my routes, my timing, my destinations, not because she demanded it, but because her worry felt like something I needed to soothe. I was managing her anxiety about my independence, and I didn't even realize it. The favors multiplied, each one building on the last like blocks in a wall I couldn't see. She'd offer to pick up my dry cleaning, run my errands, handle tasks I was perfectly capable of doing myself. Every acceptance felt like proof that I needed her, that I couldn't manage alone, that her involvement was necessary rather than intrusive. Mark praised her generosity constantly, making me feel selfish for the growing discomfort in my gut. I thanked her over and over, my gratitude becoming a currency I paid for the privilege of keeping peace. What I didn't understand then was that each yes was training me to surrender a little more control, to see myself as someone who required supervision rather than support. That gratitude became the leash I couldn't see, and I was fastening it tighter around my own neck with every polite smile. The morning I discovered my car was gone, I thought I was losing my mind. I walked into the garage with my work bag and travel mug, already mentally rehearsing the presentation I had that afternoon, and the space where my car should have been was just empty. My heart lurched, panic flooding through me as I immediately thought it had been stolen. I rushed back inside, calling for Mark, but he'd already left for an early meeting. My hand shook as I dialed his number, and that's when Linda's car pulled into the driveway. She walked in through our front door like she owned it, keys dangling from her finger. My keys. With an expression of calm concern that made my panic feel like an overreaction before I'd even spoken. "Hannah, sweetheart, sit down," she said, guiding me to the kitchen table like I was a child who needed calming. She explained that she'd come by early and noticed how exhausted I'd looked lately, how I'd mentioned being stressed about work deadlines and family obligations. She'd decided, for my own good, to take my car to her house temporarily because she was worried I wasn't safe to drive in my current state. The words came out so smoothly, so reasonable, wrapped in the language of concern and maternal wisdom. Mark had apparently mentioned I'd been having trouble sleeping, and she'd taken it upon herself to remove one more thing from my plate. I sat there, stunned, trying to process that someone had taken my property without asking, and she was presenting it as an act of love. I should have exploded, should have demanded my keys back immediately, should have seen it for exactly what it was, theft disguised as care. But Linda had spent months conditioning me to doubt my own reactions, to see her boundary violations as demonstrations of devotion. She promised it was temporary, just until I was feeling more like myself, and she'd be happy to drive me anywhere I needed to go in the meantime. My mouth opened to protest, but the words that came out were weak, uncertain. "I have that presentation today." She smiled, already grabbing her purse, saying of course she'd take me, that she'd cleared her whole day just to help. I believed her because doubt had been planted so deep in me that I couldn't tell the difference between concern and control anymore. I got in her car, my keys in her pocket, and told myself this was temporary, that she meant well, that I was lucky to have someone who cared this much. The lie tasted bitter even as I swallowed it. 3 weeks after Linda took my car, she started appearing in our financial decisions like she'd always belonged there. It began when she mentioned casually over dinner that she'd noticed our internet bill seemed high. And wouldn't it be easier if she bundled it with her own plan to save us money? Mark jumped at the idea immediately, thanking her for thinking of us. And before I could process what was happening, she was asking for our account information to set everything up. I felt a flutter of unease in my chest, but voicing concern felt petty when she was offering to help us save money. Within a week, our internet bill was in her name, and she'd text me the amount we owed her each month. A small thing that suddenly meant I had to check with her before making any changes to our service. The boundaries kept dissolving, one utility at a time, one small convenience at a time. Our phone plan was next. She had a family discount through her work that would cut our costs significantly, she explained, so practical it seemed foolish to refuse. Then she suggested managing our grocery budget because she shopped at bulk stores and could get us better deals. Before I tell you how deep this rabbit hole goes, hit that subscribe button and drop a like if you're recognizing these patterns in your own life. Each transfer of financial control came with spreadsheets, with explanations of savings, with Mark's enthusiastic agreement that his mother was really helping us build our future. I watched my autonomy slip away dressed as fiscal responsibility, and every objection I tried to raise sounded like ingratitude in my own ears. The real shift happened when Linda suggested she handle our savings account because she had investment experience and could make our money work harder. Mark was completely on board, seeing only his mother's expertise and generosity, blind to the fact that we were adults fully capable of managing our own finances. I tried to speak up during that conversation, my voice coming out smaller than I intended, saying maybe we should handle our own accounts. Linda's face fell, hurt flashing across her features as she asked if I didn't trust her, if I thought she'd do something to harm her own son. Mark looked at me with confusion and disappointment, asking why I was being difficult when his mom was only trying to help. The guilt crashed over me in waves, and I backed down, apologizing for even suggesting she had bad intentions. Within a month, I was asking permission to spend my own money, checking with Linda about purchases over $50, justifying my expenses to someone who wasn't my spouse or my financial advisor, but had somehow become both. My best friend Rachel stopped calling after the third time I had to cancel our plans because transportation was complicated. We'd been friends since college, the kind of friendship where you could show up at each other's door at midnight with wine and tears. But that version of us was fading into something distant and polite. She'd invite me to dinner, to movies, to simple coffee dates, and I'd have to explain that I needed to check if Linda was available to drive me, what Linda's schedule looked like, whether the timing worked with Linda's other commitments. Rachel started saying, "Just let me know," in this tone that meant she already knew I wouldn't show up. The day she stopped reaching out entirely, I felt the loss like a physical ache, but I was too ashamed to admit why it had happened, that I'd become so dependent I couldn't even maintain my own friendships. Family visits became negotiations that required advance approval and precise timing. My parents lived 40 minutes away, a distance that used to mean nothing when I had my own car and my own freedom. Now, seeing them meant asking Linda days in advance, coordinating with her schedule, listening to her opinions about whether the timing was really convenient or if the weather looked too risky for the drive. She never outright refused, which would have been easier to fight against. Instead, she'd sigh heavily, mention her own obligations, make it clear that driving me was an inconvenience she was willing to shoulder because she loved us so much. My dad's birthday came and went with just a phone call because Linda had a headache that day. My mom's surgery recovery happened with me visiting twice, instead of the daily visits I'd planned, because Linda said going that often was excessive and exhausting. The loneliness crept in slowly, filling spaces where people used to be. My coworkers stopped inviting me to happy hours after I couldn't join enough times. Always needing to catch a ride with Linda at exactly 5:15, no flexibility, no spontaneity. My sister gave up trying to include me in girls' weekends because the logistics were too complicated, too dependent on someone else's permission and schedule. I started spending evenings at home, just Mark and me, which he seemed to prefer anyway because his mother had always emphasized how important it was for couples to focus on each other. But it wasn't intimacy. It was isolation, wearing the mask of devotion. Every well-meaning person who drifted away took a piece of my identity with them, until I barely recognized the quiet, dependent woman I'd become. Linda would say I was protected, safe, cared for, and everyone around me nodded along, never seeing that protection had become my prison. Standing at the bus stop in the rain became my new normal, and with it came a shame I couldn't shake no matter how many times I told myself it didn't matter. I'd watch other commuters pull up in their cars, glancing at me with that mix of pity and judgment that makes you feel invisible and exposed at the same time. My work clothes would get splashed by passing traffic, my hair frizzing in the humidity, my bag growing heavy on my shoulder as I waited for buses that ran late more often than not. I was a 32-year-old professional with a master's degree, standing in the cold like a teenager who'd lost her driving privileges as punishment. The humiliation wasn't just external. It was the voice in my head asking how I'd let this happen, how I'd become so powerless in my own life. My coworkers started asking questions I had no good answers for. "Where's your car, Hannah?" they'd say casually, and I'd manufacture excuses that sounded hollow even to me. "It's in the shop. I'm trying to be more environmentally conscious. I actually enjoy the bus sometimes." Their faces would register confusion because none of it made sense for someone in my position. Someone who could clearly afford a vehicle and lived in a city where public transportation was more inconvenience than solution. One of my colleagues, Jennifer, pulled me aside after a meeting and asked gently if everything was okay at home, if I needed help with anything. The concern in her eyes made me want to cry and lie in equal measure, so I did both, tears threatening to spill as I assured her everything was fine, just some temporary car trouble. The worst part was carrying shame that wasn't even mine to bear. People assumed I was irresponsible, that I'd gotten too many tickets or a DUI, that I'd mismanaged my finances or made reckless choices that led to this consequence. I could see the assumptions forming behind their polite smiles, the way they'd offer rides with that careful kindness reserved for people they think are struggling with addiction or bad decisions. I wanted to scream that I hadn't done anything wrong, that this wasn't my fault, that someone who claimed to love me had systematically stripped away my independence and convinced everyone it was care. But those words stayed trapped in my throat, because speaking them out loud meant admitting I'd let it happen, that I'd handed over my keys and my power and my voice one small surrender at a time. I stood at those bus stops carrying the weight of other people's judgments and my own confusion about how love had turned into this. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the freezing rain, missing the bus by 30 seconds and watching its taillights disappear into traffic. I stood there soaked and shaking, my phone showing the next bus wouldn't arrive for 45 minutes, and something inside me just broke. Not dramatically, not with tears or shouting, but with a quiet clarity that felt like waking up from a dream I hadn't realized I was having. I called Linda, like I'd been trained to do, and she answered with that familiar tone of patient martyrdom. She was busy. Could I wait? Why hadn't I planned better? She'd warned me about the weather this morning. As she spoke, I heard it clearly for the first time. Concern doesn't require permission slips. Real care doesn't come with lectures. And love shouldn't feel like punishment. I thought about my parents, who'd raised me to be independent and capable, who'd celebrated every milestone of my growing autonomy. I thought about the woman I'd been before Mark, before Linda, before this slow erosion of self, someone who'd traveled alone through Europe, who'd negotiated her own salary, who'd never asked permission to exist in the world. If you're feeling this shift with me right now, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button, because what happens next changes everything. That version of me hadn't disappeared. She'd been buried under layers of manipulation so subtle I'd mistaken it for devotion. I realized with stunning clarity that care doesn't erase choices or voices. It amplifies them, supports them, celebrates them. What Linda offered wasn't care at all. It was control dressed in maternal concern, and I'd been complicit in my own captivity. Something fundamental shifted in my chest, a refusal that started small and grew into something I couldn't ignore. I told Linda I'd figure it out myself and hung up before she could respond, my hand shaking not from cold but from the audacity of that simple boundary. I called an Uber with money I'd have to justify later, and as I sat in that warm car heading home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. A flicker of power, small but unmistakable. The driver asked if I was okay, and I realized I was crying, but not from sadness. I was grieving the time I'd lost and celebrating the clarity I'd found, understanding finally that something inside me had refused to stay numb. That Tuesday afternoon in the rain became the moment I stopped accepting the unacceptable, even though I had no idea yet how to escape it. After that rainy Tuesday, my rebellion started in whispers, not explosions. I knew better than to announce my awakening in a house where every reaction was monitored, every mood interpreted, every boundary treated like an insult. So I smiled when Linda fussed over my schedule, nodded when she reminded me how lucky I was to have so much support, and pretended nothing inside me had changed. But beneath the surface, I started paying attention in a way I never had before, watching patterns, listening to language, noticing every time she used words like let and allow when talking about my life. It was like seeing the bars of a cage I'd lived in for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't the sky. The first thing I did was start saving cash, tiny amounts that wouldn't trigger questions. When I bought groceries with the shared card, I'd take $20 back in cash and tuck it into an old makeup bag in the back of my closet. If Mark gave me money for lunch, I'd eat something cheap and pocket the rest. It felt ridiculous at first, like some teenager hiding allowance money, but there was power in watching that little stack grow. Before I go on, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like if you've ever had to quietly reclaim pieces of your own life, because what happens next is where hope starts to look less like fantasy and more like a plan. Every crumpled bill I hid was a small, silent declaration. I am not as powerless as you think. Late at night, when Mark was asleep and the house was finally quiet, I started gathering documents. I found our marriage certificate, my birth certificate, my passport, and every financial statement that still arrived in paper form. I took pictures of everything with my phone, then emailed them to a new address I created that Linda didn't know about. I copied down account numbers, employer information, anything I'd need if I had to leave in a hurry. My heart pounded so loudly during those nights that I was sure someone would wake up and catch me, but no one did. Hope stopped being this vague, distant feeling and became something concrete. A file folder, a hidden envelope of cash, a growing awareness that I was building a way out brick by brick. I wasn't free yet, but for the first time in a long time, I was moving toward freedom instead of further into the dark. The turning point came on an ordinary morning that didn't look special from the outside. I was in the bathroom getting ready for work, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the mirror fogged slightly from my shower. I caught my reflection mid-motion, mascara wand in hand, hair half done, and for a second, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Her eyes looked duller than I remembered, shoulders slightly hunched, jaw clenched like she was bracing for an impact that never stopped coming. I leaned closer, really looking at myself for the first time in months, maybe years, and the question that rose up inside me was so simple it hurt. Who benefits from my fear? I thought about it in layers. My fear of saying no kept Linda comfortable, let her maintain the illusion of being the savior, the protector, the indispensable matriarch. My fear of conflict kept Mark from having to confront the ways his mother overstepped, allowed him to live in a world where everything was fine as long as he didn't look too closely. My fear of being alone kept me in a marriage where my needs ranked below everyone else's comfort. And what did I get out of all that fear? Sleepless nights, bus stop humiliation, a life that felt smaller with every passing month. Before I share what I did with that realization, hit subscribe and leave a like if you've ever looked in the mirror and wondered when you stopped recognizing yourself. The answer that settled over me that morning was cold and clear. Control needs confusion to survive, and I had been thoroughly, systematically confused. I wiped a tear from my cheek, careful not to mess up the makeup I suddenly cared very little about, and made myself a quiet promise in that fogged-up mirror. I promised that I would stop making their comfort more important than my sanity. I promised to stop apologizing for wanting basic autonomy over my own life. I promised that even if I didn't know exactly how I was going to get out, I would keep taking steps in that direction, no matter how small, no matter how scared I felt. I walked out of that bathroom the same woman on the outside. Same clothes, same routine, same house. But inside, the fracture had become a fault line. There was no going back to numbness after seeing the truth so clearly. And whether Linda knew it or not, the days of her quiet control over my life were numbered. I waited until a Sunday afternoon when Mark was home, knowing I needed him to hear this directly, not filtered through his mother's version of events later. We were all in the living room. Linda had let herself in earlier with her key, naturally, and I put down the magazine I'd been pretending to read. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my voice came out steady when I said, "Linda, I need my car keys back." The room went silent, that thick kind of quiet where you can hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Mark looked up from his laptop, confused, like I'd just asked for something that made no sense. Linda's face shifted through several expressions before settling on wounded concern. The mask she wore so well. She laughed, not cruelly, but with that dismissive lightness people use when they want to make you feel ridiculous for speaking up. "Hannah, sweetheart, we've talked about this. You're not ready yet, and I'm happy to keep helping with transportation until you're feeling more stable." The word stable landed like an accusation, implying something was wrong with me, that my need for independence was actually a symptom of instability. Mark started to nod along, already siding with her without hearing me, and something inside me snapped into absolute clarity. I looked directly at Linda, not backing down, and said slowly, "I didn't ask for your opinion about my readiness. I'm telling you to give me my keys back. Today." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Linda's expression hardened, the concerned mother facade cracking enough to show what lived underneath. Control threatened, power questioned, authority challenged. She turned to Mark, voice pitching higher with manufactured distress. "Did you hear how she's speaking to me? After everything I've done for you both? This is the gratitude I get?" Mark looked between us, clearly uncomfortable, trying to smooth things over the way he always did. But before he could speak, I continued, my words coming faster now. "You took my property without permission. You've inserted yourself into our finances without invitation. You've made me ask permission to spend my own money, see my own family, live my own life." Calling it ungrateful didn't change the truth that Linda had been using tactics of financial abuse and coercive control for months. That laugh, the one meant to make me feel small and dramatic, became the sound that broke the last thread of guilt holding me silent. That confrontation ended without resolution, just Linda storming out and Mark looking at me like I'd committed an unforgivable betrayal against his family. The next morning, while he was at work and before Linda could show up unannounced, I made a decision that terrified and freed me in equal measure. I called a rideshare to take me to a car rental place, using the cash I'd been hiding for weeks, and I rented a vehicle for the day under my own name with my own credit card, one Linda didn't know existed. Signing that rental agreement felt like the most rebellious act of my life, my hand shaking as I initialed each page. The keys they handed me were lightweight plastic, nothing special, but holding them felt like holding proof that I still existed as a person capable of independent action. I drove to Linda's house, my heart racing the entire 20-minute trip, practicing what I'd say if she answered the door. The neighborhood was quiet, mid-morning on a weekday, and her car sat in the driveway like a fortress I was about to storm. I rang the doorbell, and when she opened it, her face registered genuine shock. I wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to have the means to get here without her knowledge or permission. Before she could speak, I said the words I'd rehearsed 100 times. "I'm here for my car keys and the financial account information you've been managing. I'm taking back control of my own life, and you don't get a vote." My voice didn't shake the way I thought it would. It came out clear and final, the voice of someone who'd already made up her mind and wasn't seeking approval. Linda tried every manipulation tactic in her arsenal. Tears, anger, guilt, promises to talk about this reasonably, if I'd just calm down. She called me ungrateful, unstable, influenced by bad advice, accused me of trying to destroy the family, but I'd spent months recognizing these patterns, understanding how control disguises itself as care, and her words bounced off the armor I'd built from clarity and desperation. When she refused to get my keys, I pulled out my phone and said I'd call the police and report my car stolen. Her eyes went wide, She hadn't expected me to have that much resolve. 5 minutes later, my keys were in my hand, along with login information for the accounts she'd been managing. I walked to my car parked in her garage, got in, started the engine, and the first breath I took behind that wheel felt like surfacing after drowning. My heart raced like it finally remembered what freedom tasted like, terrifying and right at the same time, and I backed out of that driveway without looking back. The days following my confrontation with Linda felt like living in the aftermath of an earthquake. Mark came home that evening to find me sitting at our kitchen table with every financial document spread out in front of me, my laptop open to banking websites, a notebook filled with numbers that made my stomach turn. He asked what I was doing, his tone careful, like he was approaching something fragile or dangerous. I looked up at him, exhausted but clear-eyed, and said I was trying to understand what his mother had actually been doing with our money. The concern on his face shifted to defensiveness immediately. She'd been helping us, managing things, being generous. But I asked him to sit down anyway, to just look at the numbers with me before he decided I was being unreasonable. What we discovered together over the next several hours changed everything between us. The savings Linda claimed she was generating through bundled services and bulk shopping weren't materializing anywhere in our accounts. In fact, we'd been paying her significantly more each month than the actual bills cost, the difference disappearing into accounts we had no access to. The investment account she'd set up for our future contained less than a quarter of what we'd deposited over the past year, with vague explanations about management fees and market adjustments that didn't add up when I cross-referenced them with actual investment performance. Mark's face went pale as he scrolled through statements, seeing patterns he'd been too trusting to question before. His mother hadn't been protecting us. She'd been systematically siphoning money while making us believe we were being financially irresponsible without her guidance. The emotional manipulation became just as clear once we started naming it out loud. I showed Mark the research I'd done on financial abuse and coercive control, how it operates within families, how isolation and dependency are tools used to maintain power. He read about warning signs, controlling someone's access to their own vehicle, requiring permission for basic expenses, inserting yourself into a couple's finances without proper consent, and I watched his face as recognition dawned. "This is my mother," he said quietly, almost like he couldn't believe it even as the evidence sat right in front of him. We stayed up until 3 a.m, him apologizing over and over, me crying not just from relief, but from grief for the time we'd lost. I learned that night that my silence had been Linda's strongest tool. As long as no one named what was happening, it could continue unchallenged. Speaking the truth out loud, even when it hurt, was the only way to break the spell she'd cast over both of us. 3 weeks after that confrontation, I sat in a used car dealership signing papers for a vehicle that was entirely mine. Not a rental, not borrowed, not controlled by anyone's permission, but my own decision and my own money. The car wasn't fancy, a 5-year-old Honda with decent mileage and a scratch on the passenger door, but it represented something far more valuable than transportation. The salesman handed me the keys, and I held them in my palm, feeling their weight, their realness, their promise that I could leave whenever I wanted and go wherever I chose. Mark squeezed my hand, both of us understanding that this wasn't just about a car. It was about reclaiming autonomy that had been stolen so gradually I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. The first drive I took alone was deliberately aimless. No destination, no schedule, no one to report back to about where I'd been or why. I rolled the windows down despite the cold, letting the wind mess up my hair, taking turns just because I wanted to see where they led. I drove past the bus stops where I'd stood in the rain feeling ashamed and powerless, past Linda's neighborhood without slowing down, past the edges of the small world I'd been confined to for so long. The tears that came weren't sad exactly. They were the release of pressure I'd been holding in my chest for months, the physical manifestation of breathing after drowning. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, sat on the hood of my car, and called my friend Rachel, who answered on the second ring like no time had passed at all. I didn't lose my autonomy. I finally understood that truth with absolute clarity. It was stolen, systematically and deliberately, by someone who used love as a disguise for control and convinced everyone, including me, that her violations were devotion. Taking it back wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was paperwork and difficult conversations and learning to trust my own instincts again. Mark and I went to therapy together, setting boundaries with his mother that she fought against every step of the way. Some relationships didn't survive my refusal to stay small. Linda barely speaks to me now. And honestly, the silence is a relief. But the relationships that mattered, the ones built on actual respect rather than control, grew stronger. I'm not the same woman who stood at that bus stop carrying shame that wasn't hers to bear. I'm someone who knows exactly what freedom costs and refuses to ever pay the price of silence again. After hearing my story, I want you to know something important. If any part of this resonated with you, if you recognized patterns in your own life or relationships, you're not crazy and you're not alone. Control disguised as care is one of the hardest things to identify because it comes wrapped in the language of love, concern, and family devotion. The people doing it often believe their own justifications, and the people experiencing it are trained to doubt their own perceptions. But your instincts are valid, your need for autonomy is healthy, and no amount of good intentions justifies taking away someone's independence. If you're in a situation where you need to ask permission to live your own life, where your resources are controlled by someone else, where isolation feels like protection, please know that's not love, and you deserve better. I'm creating these videos not just to share my story, but to help others recognize what I couldn't see until it nearly erased me completely. Next week, I'll be posting a follow-up about the specific steps I took to rebuild my financial independence and repair my marriage after discovering the extent of the manipulation. We'll talk about setting boundaries with family members who don't respect them, recognizing red flags early, and finding resources when you're ready to reclaim your life. These aren't easy conversations, but they're necessary ones. And I'm committed to having them openly because someone's comment, someone's story, someone's courage to speak up might be exactly what another person needs to hear today. If this story touched you, if it made you think or feel or recognize something you've been avoiding, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a like if you believe people deserve autonomy in their own lives, and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from or what part of this story hit home for you. Your engagement isn't just numbers to me, it's proof that we're building a community where people can talk about these difficult truths without shame. Thank you for watching, for listening, for being here. Your freedom story matters too, and I can't wait to continue this journey with you. I'll see you in the next video.